Hey YouTubers, and welcome back to another Real Numbers video. Now this video is basically a way for me to celebrate Underworld Blood Wars coming out on Blu-ray and DVD, digital download. I think it's been on digital download for last week. You know, they started releasing digital download earlier these days. But anyway, Underworld Blood Wars is coming out tomorrow on Blu-ray and DVD, and you gotta know I'm excited for that stuff. As much as I've talked about it just like little by little on my channel, honestly, I'm a huge fan. I've always been a huge fan of these films ever since they basically started coming out. And I guess kind of wrapping around and just trying to make a whole conversation, I'm also going to be talking about Resident Evil as well. Because, you know, if you're any type of fan or even if you've seen either one of these movies, you know they're basically the exact same film. And today we're just going to be discussing whether Screen Gems or Sony in general is actually done with either of these franchises. Now, I guess it's kind of a little bit easier to say whether or not they're done with the latter. Resident Evil was kind of marketed and pushed as the final chapter, while Underworld Blood Wars was kind of pushed as something of a... I don't know if I would say it was a, start of a new trilogy. Obviously, if you did see the film, which numbers indicate that you guys probably didn't see the film, but I'll get more into that later. But it did kind of indicate, the story-wise indicated that it was kind of a send-off for Celine's character, Kate Beckinsale. And news prior to that, there was kind of talk that Theo James was going to be kind of put in his own spin-off film or maybe even take over the franchise, but then that was kind of squashed. There was also kind of talk of doing one more film or even two more films and doing some kind of a television show. And with Resident Evil, although it was the end and it was like, although they did say it was the end, I've heard a lot of people say that it wasn't necessarily the end. Obviously... I've heard that it actually has somewhat of a, an open ending. I haven't necessarily seen it right now. But anyway, so let's just talk about exactly whether or not Screen Gems is actually done with these franchises. Now, in order to talk about this, let's say that Underworld Blood Wars, they produced that film for about $35 million. And obviously giving that and also anything in relation to, anything that was basically marketing wise or anything, I would probably kind of put it at another 35 to 50 million just going into it. And honestly, I'm actually really kind of disappointed with as much as it made. It only made about 30 million domestically, which was kind of to be expected. It wasn't necessarily going to be the biggest film, but considering that it's only at this point made $50 million internationally is something that I feel it's just didn't seem right for this particular franchise. It's not that this franchise has always been really big, but when the last film came out in 2012, it made $62 million domestically and $97 million internationally. Now, granted, that was still when 3D was kind of a big deal and was kind of upping ticket prices for what it was worth. And it was kind of the next film. We hadn't necessarily seen Kate Beckinsale back in the role, and she really carries these films. But we hadn't seen her because she kind of stepped out of the prequel. That was the third film, and obviously there might have been some pent-up demand for that, at least domestically, that there wasn't necessarily for the last film or this particular film. And I don't necessarily know if that's the case. I really feel like the fourth film that a lot of people didn't really like, so maybe they were just turned off in general and they didn't want to see the next film that was going to just be a little bit more of the same. Like I said, personally, I liked it, but you don't know. But $62 million domestically for the fourth film, Underworld Awaken, and then $97 million internationally. Considering the fall that we've seen for this franchise, honestly, I'm kind of a little bit worried about its future. I was really kind of hoping and really expecting that it was going to overperform internationally because, as it were, that these films actually do better internationally than they've ever done. At least more recently, they've done better internationally than they've ever done domestically. It was supposed to be kind of the saving grace, I think. The whole concept I had been reading about was perhaps they spent less money on this particular film, and obviously so they can probably spend less money and get a bigger profit internationally in order to probably make a bigger amount of money and probably justify those television shows and those sequels and that spin-off and everything else that they were thinking about doing. With only making around 82 million, I don't necessarily see them or 81 million, I don't necessarily see them actually coming back and trying to, I guess, make any more of these films. Now, I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong, but at the same time, I just don't necessarily see that happening. On the other hand, we have Resident Evil: The Final Chapter, which I did make a video about this the other day, about how this was actually a film this film basically made the entire franchise push forward over $1 billion. And honestly, a lot of that, and I mean a lot of that, even though every single one of these films has performed very well, the last 3 films in general have just kind of taken off in terms of actually making a ton of money ever since the 4th film. And when the 4th film came out, that's when China really started to China actually really started to grow up as a international film market. It was always fairly strong, but it's gotten so much more powerful over the course of the last couple of years, even the last decade, that now it's probably it's the second biggest film market, and it will very, very soon become the largest film market, second biggest in terms of how many people are actually living in a society and actually go see the film. We're bigger at this point, but I mean, it's not by much. And there are people who would indicate that it is the biggest, and some people who indicate that it isn't the biggest. I mean, it just depends on who you're asking and what facts they throw at you. So China has really helped this film the Resident Evil films kind of just really take off. And at the same time, considering that this is kind of the Biohazard property, the Resident Evil game franchise, that was always something that always helped it make a money in places like Japan, where, this is kind of more of a mainstream franchise than it is here. So it always has a reliable audience in those 3 markets, and 3 of the biggest film markets. So obviously they always do fairly well. But considering that this was the most successful one of all of them, if you're just taking raw numbers, not even counting inflation and all that stuff, which, obviously plays into it, but at the same time, with the film making around and nearly even just $285 million internationally, almost $300 million, you can imagine that Screen Gems and Sony would want to kind of continue to make these films. Probably not with Milla Jovovich, maybe not even with Paul W.S. Anderson, but at the same time continue to make these films, be it the prequel that they talked about in years prior or anything like that. I really think that they want to probably continue this. Now, obviously, like Underworld, even making less money than Underworld, not $30 million, but even less, made only $26 million. Both those films had their lowest showing of the entire franchise thus far. And I know that that's hurting them. And I know that they're looking at that stuff and thinking that although it might not seem the best, like it might not seem like the most hurtful situation for them because they're making so much money internationally. I mean, both of these films, even with a $35 million budget for Underworld, you still have to consider the amount that they kind of take a cut in other places where these films do really well, and they don't necessarily get all the money that we're looking at, and maybe their profit lines aren't as big as something like this. And the problem with these is these aren't necessarily toy franchises anywhere. You get your money from basically the movie, the home releases, the digital downloads, the syndication rights, and it's a lot of money, and it will probably make its budget back. But you got to imagine that they make the most of their money. I mean, the biggest profit on every ticket sale in domestic numbers. And I don't necessarily think that these are really, really compelling signs for either of these films to, I guess, continue on if they're only going to be performing internationally. These movies, no matter how much anyone wants to talk about, have to be performing both internationally and domestically at least a little bit in order to see a profit before they actually go to home video. And with home video basically going, down the gutter in terms of how much money it's actually possible to be made, and other things not necessarily bringing in a profit here and there, it doesn't matter that these films will eventually make a profit. They want to make the quickest amount of money possible. Now, with that being said, both these films probably will make a profit. Underworld has definitely made a profit with as much as it's made because it was only made for about $40 million. And I can only imagine it only had I can imagine that it's marketing was basically, I guess, $35 to $50 million in even. So obviously it already made money. So personally, I feel like this, and it's kind of a hard thing to say for me, but I definitely think that while Screen Gems probably wants to figure out how to continue on with the Resident Evil franchise, I feel like personally they might be done with the Underworld franchise. And like I said, I don't necessarily like that, but I just think it's par for course at this point. Like, I feel like it's not necessarily making the money that it's actually making. Now, I could be wrong. I could be thinking this way too heavily, and I could not be seeing where they might be making some of their money or how they might be cutting corners in terms of actually how much they actually spent on it. They obviously didn't spend a ton of marketing costs over here, but I just assumed that it was basically going to be used to market it overseas. Maybe they didn't, and the $81 million they made really helped to basically make as much money as they could, in terms of, it might have not been a huge profit moneymaker for them, but it was a good enough moneymaker that they might go forward with another film, or maybe even a spin-off film, or maybe even that television show that they talked about. So with that being said, just kind of an update for that. These are two franchises that I really, really enjoy. They're huge guilty pleasures for me. And I honestly would like to see them continue both of them. But at the same time, like, just numbers wise, I feel like there's reason to worry about doing any more films of either franchise. Although, like I said, I feel like Resident Evil definitely does have a better chance of being made into more films, while the Underworld movies might not actually have that type of prosperity going forward. So please make sure to rate, comment, and subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comment section below, and don't forget to share this out to your friends. And I'm gonna catch you on the next Real Numbers video. Bye.